5 categories that if you understand those 5 categories, when you look at a patient, you're halfway home right there. In the first place, we go back to what old Deerfield said many years ago in Detroit. Now, some of you have heard this story, some of you young fellas haven't. It'll be worth repeating. How did all this leg check start in the first place? Deerfield was an old-time chiropractor in Detroit, and he furnished the service for the railroads. And when the patient had an injury in the back, an arm or a leg, something that the medical people didn't take care of, they sent him to Deerfield. And he was remarkably successful in straightening these people out. Well, he had a case come in one day. He checked this man's legs. He found the leg on the left side was, say, 1.5 inches short. He checked the legs. Nothing he could do after that straightened those legs. He gave him a roll. He gave him all the techniques that he had. Nothing changed, and the man still had pain. Well, this worried Deerfield. He had him come in the second day. Same thing. On the third day when he came in, he laid the patient down, and before he started to manipulate him, the phone rang. It's a small office. Deerfield answered the phone, and this was a change in history. He asked the patient to raise his head and turn his head towards him where he could give him a message, and as he did, he noticed something remarkable. When the man turned his head, his leg automatically balanced. That's the first time he'd been able to balance it. Now you begin to think, how can this man become balanced, only turning his head when I've done everything there was to straighten it? Of course, the answer was simple. He hadn't done the right thing. So he went up after the phone conversation was over. He said, turn your head straight down. He did. Out you come. Turn your head right again, even it up. So with the head turned to the point where it leveled the legs, which we know now was the balance between facilitatory and inhibitory at that moment. He felt down the man's neck, and he felt a little bump protruding. And for no reason that he could tell, he just took a little TM contact on that, and there was a sharp click. The guy kind of flinched, put his head down, looked, now the legs were balanced. He let him lay there a couple of minutes and got up, and the guy went this way and this way. He said, "My pain's gone. What happened? Why didn't you do this before?" Well, of course, he hadn't got to it. That's talking that. But anyway, Deerfield was ecstatic now. He thought, now I have the answers that I've been looking for. So a few days after that, he had another bad one, very similar. He made his adjustments, nothing happened. So laid him down, he said, turn your head, and nothing happened. Now he's right back where he started. But he saw at one point, when he turned the head right, left, and could straighten the legs, he knew what to do. He found, too, that when the leg balance changed, the leg would be short, let's say, on the left. When the legs were extended, he'd bring them up like this, and they change over, as you've all seen in the office. He called this a positive Deerfield. And he noticed that the hip would rise on the side of that short leg. So he experimented by adjusting the PI ilium on the side of the short leg when the legs did cross over, like this. And he was very successful with it. But then he ran into many cases where there was no change. Stayed short at the bottom, stayed short at the top, no change at all. Head, nothing, changing. And the more he adjusted on these people, on the back, the worse the patient got. So he finally hypothesized it's either a condyle or an anatomical short leg. Now I want to talk about 3 hours on anatomical short legs. I'll take about that long. In the first place, universal intelligence has never made any two things the same. And there is the miracle of creation. Whether it's a field of grass, whether it's a strain of fish, or birds, or bees, or trees, the two are ever the same. So obviously, no human body ever had two femurs the same length. There may be a one person over here and another one over here. They might match those femurs to come out right, but you're never going to find any human body with two, all the way from almost nothing, up we'll say to a quarter of an inch. So we can say this, everybody has 100% of imbalance between the fingers. But it doesn't mean anything because, thank you, because innate is the greatest balancing mechanism in the world. And probably the thing in chiropractic that has upset more spines than anything I ever heard of is heel lifts. If ever there was a work of the devil, it's a heel lift. If the guy's got a real deficiency from trauma, it's all right to put that under it and then put it on the sole too. But it's pretty stupid to make a man's foot like this, where when he walks, he drops his foot and the ilium on that side slides forward. So innate will balance this spine out. Even if there is slight pathology and he's a little shorter on one side, she'll take it up someplace else. And what makes people healthy is spinal balance, not straight or crooked spines. BJ said one time, in fact he said a lot of times, crooked spines do not make people sick. It's interference in the spine that makes them sick. Otherwise, some of the hunchbackers who were walking around with nothing open but the atlas and axis would have been long gone if they lived as long as the rest of us. Okay. Now we come back to our theme again. We have the Deerfield system, which says it's the legs cross over. You touch the ilium on the side of the short leg, and that's it. Now, we know that there's other things to do besides that. We'll just hold at that for a minute because that's one of them. Then we have a condition where the leg is short on one side, and when we elevate the leg, still stays short. And that is the most interesting of all, as you'll see when we get back to it. That's the negative Deerfield. That's two. Then we have the case that fools lots of people in that when they measure the legs out, they're balanced. He said, what else could you ask for? All you got to do is flex those legs and find a chain as much as 1.5 inches, which means that the inhibitory and facilitatory mechanisms are only partly getting through, not all the way. Now you got 3 of them. Then you have the case where you measure the man's legs perfectly level. You bring those legs up and they're perfectly level. Now you're going to say, this guy's great, there couldn't possibly be anything wrong here. Well, wait, when his leg's straight, turn his head to the left leg pulls up. Turn his head to the right leg pulls up. So you've got a bilateral cervical syndrome. Now then we've got the 4 of them. There's one other one. Cervical syndrome. Anytime turning the head to the left or to the right will balance the spine, you better look to the cervicals for some correction. You may have to do something else someplace, but that's the major. So it's a very easy thing if you understand what innate does to correct these misalignments according to the area in which you find them. Now, let's look at something else. We talked about adaptation. When a man's cervical spine slips out, he adapts to that. And many times the adaptation in the lower spine, which is necessary to maintain balance, causes him trouble because it begins to pinch that disc now a little bit. Was it V's? Begins to pinch that disc a little bit. Now our boy's in trouble. Started up here, ends up down here. Now we can adjust that locally. But that's an adaptation. And when we do that, and we don't touch it up here, we're upsetting innate even more. You're upsetting what she's already done to get out of the mess she was in, and you've made more of a mess out of it. So with a system where you can determine these 2 mechanisms, inhibitory and facilitatory, you've got it made. Now another thing that many of you have warned about, they say, well, the patient, when she lays on her stomach, has one reading. When she lays on her back, she has another. You'll notice now that most people who are very heavy will even be more so. Because when you have the patient on the back, the viscera push down and tend to level the spine. Where if you have them on your stomach, the spine can float, and that's where to take your readings from the stomach side, not the upper side. There's so much to know, and it seems like we've spent so many years getting to it. When you have that patient down and you begin to read these signs. Now, in the negative tear field, which is the one that the fellows will demonstrate many times, it's a many-splendored thing, but it is so accurate in the way that it fixes itself in the spine, it almost defies imagination. When you'll find legs do not cross over, you'll immediately find trigger points that are just as sure as God made green apples. They're there. Now the reason that they're there is because you have a little muscle called the semimembranosus and semitendinosus, which runs from the pubic tube or the ischial tuberosity up to the internal lateral condyle, or to the ischial tuberosity rather, from here to here. When you have a negative tear field, we've determined now that that muscle is under constant contraction. When that muscle is under constant contraction, it pulls down the ilium, which in turn pulls the sacrum low and anterior on that side. And when it does, it tightens all the ligaments up on that short leg side so that you have a trigger point over the pubic tubercle, over the ischial tuberosity, over the PSS, posterior supine ilium, and the internal or medial condyle of the femur. All four of those points are as hot as fire. Now, many patients have had that for years and years and years, resulting in all kinds of bladder difficulties, resulting in prostatic difficulties, all kinds of menstrual disturbances, because that nerve is pinched. And if it's pinched, it means that the ischium is anterior on that side, so the farther you push it from the posterior side, the more fixed it becomes. This particular adjustment is so fantastic that many times people can't hardly get their arm up at all. When that pelvic adjustment made them put their arm straight up. So we find that most all troubles in the shoulder and arm are to somewhat connected with the negative tear field. Now, it hasn't been easy to put all this stuff in order at all, but we've done it. And more times now, we're getting out over the countryside. I've been to more colleges than I knew existed in the last year. And there's demands on us for this information. It frees your mind. You don't have to worry any longer. Let's take it, for instance. Here's a fellow that you take the cervical x-rays on, and you can't tell which side. It's so perfectly aligned. You say, well, how can it be? If you can lay that guy down and look at his legs and turn his head right and left, and you darn soon will find out which side it is. It'll pull it up on one side and let it down on the other. Now we